It's the Maxwell Institute podcast. I'm Blair Hodges. Thanks for downloading another episode. We're about to delve into the most famous Hindu book of scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Richard Davis recently published a biography of the Gita as part of Princeton University Press's Lives of Great Religious Book series. We've been interviewing authors who contribute to that series. Davis is a professor of religion at Bard College, and his book tells the Gita's story from its beginnings in ancient India to its renaissance in the early 20th century in the West, to its place in the hearts and minds of Hindus today. The Gita consists of a conversation between a man named Arjuna and the god Krishna about war and violence and duty and obligation. Millions have looked to the Gita for insight into the struggle for self-mastery that we all must wage. Questions or comments about this and other episodes of the Maxwell Institute podcast can be emailed to MIPodcast@byu.edu. Don't forget to rate and review the show in iTunes and help us grow our audience. Richard Davis, thank you for joining us today on the Maxwell Institute podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Blair.
So I wanted to begin with an overview of the Bhagavad Gita because most of my listeners probably haven't read it and maybe aren't very familiar with it. So let's start with an overview then.
Okay, I'd be glad to. So the Bhagavad Gita is a very small portion of a much larger Indian epic poem called the Mahabharata. And the Mahabharata tells the story of a great war. It tells a story about how in ancient times the warrior class of India became increasingly fractious and contentious, leading to a sort of a war that involved all of the rulers of India, but it was centrally between two sets of cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And on the Pandava side, and they're portrayed in the Mahabharata primarily as the good guys, although they have many faults, the premier warrior on the Pandava side is a character named Arjuna. And in the battle that takes place at the center of the Mahabharata, his friend and brother-in-law, Krishna, acts as his charioteer. Just before the battle, as the two sides have lined up in enormous battle array, Arjuna asks his charioteer Krishna to take him out in front of in the no man's land between the two lines of battle, and so that he can see, what this situation is. And when he gets there, he has a real crisis. He says that he's experiencing grief and anxiety and a confusion over what his duty is. And Krishna, his charioteers are usually considered lower in the hierarchy of things, begins to talk to him and advise him, and ultimately to persuade him that he should indeed fight in this battle. As he does so, Krishna becomes increasingly philosophical. And also, in the course of the conversation, he reveals that he is God. He is the supreme God. And after 700 verses of this conversation, Arjuna says, well, yes, okay, finally, I do agree with you. I see now my duty. I recognize that I will be doing your will in this battle, and I will go ahead and fight. And so at the end of the Bhagavad Gita, then we have Arjuna ready to fight, and in the Mahabharata, as it continues, Arjuna fights with Krishna's continuing advice and help, and the Pandavas emerge victorious in this battle, but it's a very grievous battle. Millions of people are killed, and the Pandavas have to deal with the grief that they feel over the war really for the rest of their lives. So it's a story about the Bhagavad Gita is a story of persuasion, philosophical persuasion, and ultimately a sort of a devotional text. But it's in this broader context of war And the war context, I think, is a very important part of the whole Bhagavad Gita.
So there have been Christian texts of sort of just war theory. Is this comparable to that, or did it serve a wider purpose in its original context?
Yes. So it is a just war text in the sense that it sets out the duty for a member of the warrior class, a kshatriya. And so Krishna is telling Arjuna that, in fact, his duty as a warrior is to fight in a righteous cause, even if that involves killing his relatives. So for Arjuna, one of the central conflicts is a conflict over whether his family is his duty as a member of a family is more important than his duty as a warrior. Because on the other side are his cousins and his teachers. So it is that in itself is a big problem that Krishna resolves by saying, well, in this case, this is a righteous battle. You should do your duty as a warrior. And he goes on to try to explain that he uses the Hindu concept of transmigration, which was a fairly new concept at this time, to explain that in this battle, in fact, you won't be killing souls, you will only be killing bodies. So that's a kind of a philosophical perspective on just war theory in a way. But in the course of this battle, because Krishna is also presenting himself as God, increasingly war kind of takes a back seat, and more the text as it goes along becomes a kind of a devotional text, a text about how to worship God. And in the course of that, then Krishna says, Arjuna, you will in this battle be my instrument. You will be my weapon.
About what time period are we looking at again in terms of when the text was probably written and what geographical area?
Right. It's definitely a text from northern India, and the time of its composition has been a source of great controversy over the centuries. Hindus, many of them believe that it was written thousands of years ago, 5,000 years ago. Scholars generally would place it in the early centuries CE, although even then it's still controversial. So I talk about it as a text from classical India, which is for me a period from about 400 BC to 400 or 500 CE. And I would place it again maybe in the first 2 centuries CE.
Okay, so Krishna appears in this text first as sort of a lower caste, sort of charioteer here.
Yes. He's adopted this position. He is actually a prince in the Mahabharata. He's a ruler of another kingdom, and he's a friend, a special friend to the Pandavas. But throughout the text, he's a kind of a mysterious character, and only in certain moments and to certain people does he actually reveal that he is God. So some characters are aware of this, but by and large, throughout the text, he's treated much more as just a human being.
There's a striking moment in the text where Krishna reveals himself, right? Where he actually sort of takes off or manifests himself as this huge visual representation, sort of.
Yes, exactly so. This is in chapter 11, and it's a wonderful moment. And for me, really, it's the kind of the high point of the Bhagavad Gita. At a certain point, he has explained in words to Arjuna that he is God. And finally, Arjuna says, okay, yes, I agree. I can understand that, you are who you say you are, but I'd like to see it. And so Krishna says, okay, you can see this, but in order to see it, you will need divine vision. And so he grants Arjuna divine vision, the ability to see what is in fact really there. And once Arjuna sees this supernal form of Krishna, which is an overwhelming vision, and includes, among other things, Arjuna sees all of the warriors being swallowed up, going into the flames that are coming out of Krishna's many mouths. So it's a horrific vision in part. And Arjuna finally says, "Oh, please, take this away. I don't want to see this anymore." In a way, it reflects the vision reflects Arjuna's own situation and his own anxieties about the battle. And I think it's important also that it's not that Krishna transforms himself, but that he grants Arjuna this ability to see what is in fact the case. So Arjuna is in fact seeing this broader realm of Krishna's existence that for the most part he as a human being is not able to see.
Okay, so after this divine vision, then is that when Krishna goes on to sort of explain the paths, the ways to worship God after that point, or before that point?
Yeah, both before and after. And I sometimes think of the instructions that come after as a kind of a post baptismal catechism or something. It's on the one hand he has already set all this out in an effort to persuade Arjuna, but once the vision has taken place, the teachings go on, but there's a sort of a different quality, and I think that it has that quality of, okay, now you are initiated, and now here are the further instructions. So the instructions continue to have to do with the three paths of action and knowledge and devotion.
So those are the three paths to...
Those are the three paths to kind of spiritual attainment. And Krishna, I should say that the Bhagavad Gita itself doesn't set them out as precisely as that, but that's a long-standing commentarial tradition that the Bhagavad Gita deals with these three paths.
So it kind of talks about different elements of attaining salvation, and these are kind of the categories of things, the ways people have categorized them after the fact of saying.
Exactly so. Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so that kind of gives us a basic overview of the text itself. So I want to switch gears here and talk about your connection to the text. How did your interest in the Gita begin? I'm interested kind of in your religious and academic backgrounds and whatever led you to this topic.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's a long story, and I'll try to keep it brief. But I was raised a Christian in a small Midwestern Protestant denomination. And when I went to college, I went to the University of Chicago, and I became very interested in other religions at that point in my life. This was the early 1970s, so there was a lot of kind of exploration among people in my generation. And my first contact with the Bhagavad Gita actually came because I was doing a kind of a fieldwork study of Krishna consciousness, of the this devotional community that had been established in the 1960s in the United States by Swami Prabhupada. And I was going to write a junior paper on the small, it was a five Krishna consciousness devotees in Chicago, and I went and worked with them, interviewed them, stayed with them, and they gave me my first copy of the Bhagavad Gita. It was kind of mysterious, and it was a very important text to them, but I couldn't say that I understood it. When I was a graduate student, I came back to it. I studied it both historically and linguistically. That is, it was a Sanskrit text. I was studying Sanskrit, so it was one of the really good teaching texts for a young Sanskritist. And I learned about the role of the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata in the history of Hinduism and the history of Indian religions as a graduate student. So my real introduction to the study of the Bhagavad Gita was as a historical text. And in the 27 years that I've been teaching Indian religions and Hinduism in colleges, that's the way I have most often presented it. This is a text from classical India. It is dealing with these kinds of issues that were very important, that were crucial to people at that time in India. The Bhagavad Gita was responding to this or that different other religious group, and also political questions and issues. So my primary orientation towards the Bhagavad Gita before writing this book really has been that it is a historical text from classical northern India. So writing this book, the experience of writing this book really led me to explore the way the Bhagavad Gita has continued to live, right? That's the premise of this whole series of books. And it's been really a valuable experience for me, because it's led me to see just how widely and differently later readers have understood and made use of the text.
So you come to the text as a scholar, but also as a Christian. And I know for some Christians, when they approach the Bible critically that way, it can raise questions or concerns for them. When you approach a different religious tradition's revered text, like the Bhagavad Gita, what sort of things do you have to keep in mind as someone from a different religious tradition approaching a religious text?
Yes. Thanks for asking that. That's a really good question, a hard question. So I'll start with an anecdote. When I was just beginning to work on this book, the denomination of Christianity that I belong to, the United Church of Christ, came up with a slogan that we were going to use. And, so at my particular church, it was placed on a placard out in front of the church. And the slogan was, "God is still speaking." And for me, this was a really kind of a seminal slogan because I thought, oh yeah, right. And for Hindus, Krishna is still speaking, right? God is still speaking. And so it gave me a kind of an entry point to thinking of the way in which a scripture continues to speak over time. So I think my attitude towards reading Hindu texts prior to working on this book was, well, yes, this was, these are historical texts. These are scriptures that address issues of that particular time, just as I also read the Bible as, Jesus was addressing his own situation as a Israelite peasant, a Jewish peasant under conditions of occupation, Roman occupation. So historically reading scriptures is one way of not having to deal with the universal claims that religious scriptures do make. And I now try to have it both ways, I think. Yes, they are historical texts. Yes, it is important to study them historically. And yet, yes, they also make very compelling claims that have to be taken very seriously. So I think one of the most interesting things to me has been looking at the way in which other Christians and other Americans have tried to deal with the Hindu claim, the claims that this Hindu text makes, right? Can we really, how do we apply that teaching of one's duty as a warrior, having supervening one's duty as a member of a family? Well, that's is that applicable? Yes. I mean, here we have a movie like American Sniper, sort of addressing some of the same questions. And these are living questions. And I think, as a result of working on this book, try to think more seriously about how the same claims can be thought of in parallel with contemporary conditions.
In your university work, have you had any students take your classes that were devotees of the text?
I do have that sometimes, yes. And in those cases, I say, well, that's all well and good. This is a university, this is a college, and your faith commitments are really personal faith commitments. And I'm going to teach you this text as a literary text, as a philosophical text, and as a historical text. So in a college classroom, I in accord, I think, with the sort of customs of secular academia, I try to not make faith statements a primary part of the conversation.
There must be kind of a variety of reactions to that, but has it been generally positive for students who are also devotees of the text? Have they enjoyed your classes usually? Are there difficulties that they encounter as a result of the ways you look at it in a university setting?
Yeah, most often I would say that there's a lot of appreciation for that. And it's been less true since I've been teaching at Bard, but my first position was teaching at Yale University, where there were and are a lot of students of South Asian descent whose ethnic background is Hindu. And so they would come at it as, young people who were looking and trying to understand the background of their own faith. And with those students in particular, the historical background and context that a university course can bring to understanding these texts was really valuable. Students would come up to me sometimes and say, well, now I understand, where my grandmother back in India is coming from. It would provide a kind of a broader context for understanding things that they had experienced but never understood in that kind of intellectual way that we hope they will get it in a college setting.
That's Richard Davis. He's a professor of religion and director of the Asian Studies program at Bard College in New York, and he's author of a biography of the Bhagavad Gita in the Lives of Great Religious Book series. Let's talk about authorship for a minute. We mentioned it a little bit earlier, but like many ancient religious texts, the origins of the Gita have proven to be somewhat controversial. So who wrote this text, and what do different people say about the authorship of this text?
Right. Well, I have about 5 different answers to that question. One answer, a very Hindu answer, is that God wrote it. That is that these are the words of Krishna, that Krishna did in fact incarnate himself in history and did present these teachings to Arjuna on the battlefield, and that they have been then passed on through generations. Another conventional answer is that a character named Vyasa, who wrote the Mahabharata, recorded the Bhagavad Gita. That is, that he actually appears as a very important character in the Mahabharata, but he is credited with being the person who put the Mahabharata story together.
Is he the one whose his name means compiler or something?
Compiler, like exactly so, yes. So those are 2 answers. The Mahabharata itself explains its own conditions of recitation as a series of oral recitations. So the main recitation takes place at a sacrifice that's being performed by one of Arjuna's descendants, Janamejaya, and it's told to him in a conversation with a pupil of Vyasa named Vaishampayana. And so that conversation is one telling of the Mahabharata. But then it turns out that there's somebody else who's sitting at the sacrifice, and he hears this entire conversation, and then he goes back to another sacrifice, and a bunch of sages are there and saying, hey, what did you hear when you were at this other sacrifice? And then he explains the same thing. So the Mahabharata presents itself as a series of oral conversations, and that's one way that scholars have often understood the conditions of the Mahabharata's own composition. That is, a series of stories that were told and retold and gradually expanded over time, over several centuries, and finally, at some point, put into a final form that was probably written down. So one of the things that scholars have done over the last 2 centuries has been to say, well, then there must have been an earlier original Mahabharata. Can we get back to the original Mahabharata? And so critical editors have sort of sifted through all of the different manuscript versions of the Mahabharata. And it turns out that all of the manuscripts that we have, and there are hundreds of them, all point back to what was probably a single written version of the Mahabharata that again, scholars would postulate was put into written form maybe around the 4th or 5th century CE. So the Bhagavad Gita, as part of that, was a composition within the Mahabharata that, again, has to have been before that final written redaction of the text. So another controversy that scholars have engaged in over the last 200 years is whether the Bhagavad Gita was originally a separate composition that was somehow stuck into, planted into the larger Mahabharata, or whether it grew up in the course of the Mahabharata itself. And on that point, I'm with the second camp. I believe that the Bhagavad Gita is a very integral part of the Mahabharata. And
what kind of clues are scholars looking for when they're making that sort of a distinction? Because it's not like you can interview somebody from back then or find a manuscript from back then that says this was originally part of it.
Yes, originally. So, yes. Well, there have to do with different kinds of meters that are used and the vocabulary that's used. But probably the largest thing has been the kind of what one scholar, very well-known scholar, called the dramatic absurdity of it, right? So, it would be absurd for, a moment just before battle, while these two great armies are facing one another, for two people to go out and have this conversation, which, would take an hour and a half or so. Mm-hmm. So it can't possibly have, the composers of the Mahabharata couldn't possibly have imagined that this could take place. And therefore, it must have been a separate composition that was kind of stitched into the text. There is actually no final way of resolving the question. It has to do, I think, mostly, for me, it has to do really with the way in which the conversation that takes place in the Bhagavad Gita addresses the kind of the concerns that are that are echoed throughout the text, throughout the epic Mahabharata, and the way in which the subsequent narrative sort of continues to reflect and echo those points.
I mean, does the question even matter that much to devotees? Are the stakes high for Hindu people when they're thinking about when it originated?
Not at all. Not at all. No. And so what is important is that from an early point, the Bhagavad Gita began to circulate as an independent text mm-hmm. that could be read aside from its placement in the Mahabharata, right? That it was a self-standing philosophical text, right? So just as you could take a book out of the Christian Bible, right? So too you could take the Bhagavad Gita and read it as a self-standing text. Mm-hmm. And that text, the Bhagavad Gita, became a text that many philosophers in medieval India commented on. So it became a kind of one of the core texts that philosophers of the Vedanta school would comment on to convey their own philosophical and religious positions.
Okay, so that kind of gets into this question about the rise of interpretive communities, right? So
yes,
first, can you take just a second to just situate the Gita in the broader devotional You call it the broader devotional cult surrounding the divine character of Krishna. So maybe situate the Gita within that broader devotional cult, and then talk a little bit about the rise of these interpretive communities and what they did with the text.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So in medieval Hinduism, Krishna became the center of a major devotional cult throughout India. But most of the devotionalism that was directed at Krishna didn't have to do with his role in the Bhagavad Gita, or indeed with his role in the Mahabharata. A lot of it focused on the earlier parts of his life, which are told in other texts, in which he grew up as a member of a cowherd community. And was a very charming, kind of rambunctious young infant, and then a very alluring, seductive adolescent whom all of the gopis, the female cowherdesses, fell in love with. So it was a kind of a pastoral and erotic cult, really. And so a lot of the devotional poetry, devotional songs, devotional plays that focused on Krishna in medieval India actually didn't have much to do with the Bhagavad Gita. On the other hand, so that's one kind of interpretive community that actually is taking Krishna off in a different direction. But at the same time, in the Vedanta school, which became one of the preeminent philosophical school of medieval India, the Bhagavad Gita was taken to be one of the three, it's called the Prasthana Traya, the 3 points of departure. So if you were going to be a major Vedanta philosopher, you had to write commentaries on these 3 texts. Mm-hmm. One was the Upanishads, which is part of the Vedas, and that was classified as Shruti. That was classified as having the highest religious authority.
Would it be considered divine revelation, like actual?
Well, yes, actually
from God, or?
Well, in fact, it was said to be non-human in origin.
Okay.
So it exists eternally. It exists, the world comes into creation and goes out of creation and comes back into creation. The Vedas persist through all of those creations and destructions.
Okay. So that's Shruti, scripture.
That's Shruti, and that has the highest, for Orthodox Hindus, that has the highest religious authority.
That's not where the Gita is situated, though, right?
And the Gita is not. The Gita is not Shruti. It is considered Smriti, which means remembered. And those are texts that are not Vedic, but convey the underlying principles or codes that are consistent with Vedic thinking. So the Bhagavad Gita was one of those Smriti texts, but it was singled out as being one that philosophers of this Vedanta school should comment on.
This is where comparative religion gets a little tricky, right? When we're thinking about the concept of scripture. So your book is part of a series on the lives of great religious books. Christians and Jews usually think of religious books in terms of scripture, but in your book you talk about how calling the Gita the Hindu Bible, as some people did early on as it was being translated into English and other languages, is problematic, right?
It is indeed. Yes. So the idea of the Hindu Bible probably originates in the 19th century. Nowadays, if you go to India and ask a bunch of Hindus, well, we Christians have our Bible and the Muslims have their Quran. What's your Bible? The Bhagavad Gita would turn up, fairly regularly as the Hindu Bible.
Was it because no one wanted to read the whole Mahabharata, or what? Like, oh, that's sizable.
Yeah, no. Well, it's true that the Vedas, right, which are the texts that if one was going to cite anything as the proper Hindu Bible, they should cite the Vedas. But the Vedas were written in a very old form of Sanskrit that, by and large, people didn't understand anymore. A lot of the Vedas have to do with ritual matters or hymns to gods who are no longer worshipped. So the Vedas really, on the one hand, occupied the category of Bible. But they didn't have the status. They didn't have the living quality of the Bible, except for with very few, very sort of limited communities. So the Bhagavad Gita was singled out for a number of reasons, both by Western observers and then increasingly by Indians, as having a kind of a Bible status, in that it was what are the features that made it appealing as a Bible? Well, it was it was a monotheistic text. So for Christian missionaries or British scholars, that was a good feature for a Bible to have. And for Hindus, and particularly for Hindus who were active in the independence movement, that is the movement to gain Indian independence from British colonial control, the Bhagavad Gita seemed to offer some very pertinent teachings in a text that was ancient, that was classical. So it had certain features that made it really appealing to the Indian independence movement, and so that too gave the Bhagavad Gita a much greater kind of dissemination within the Indian population. So it I would say that from the beginning of the 19th century to the 21st century, the status of the Bhagavad Gita has been on the upswing.
When figures like Gandhi, for example, would take up the Gita and use it in some of their, Gandhi would use it, for his purposes. How would that contrast with some of the earlier interpretive communities? Are there, within Hinduism, there's obviously no overarching authority that sort of declares what the proper canon is or anything like that, or sort of what the proper bounds of belief are. So you have this text that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. How does it function then authoritatively for Hindu people?
Yes, well, that's a question that the Indian interpreters of the late 19th and early 20th century had to contend with, so they basically were arguing that this is a modern text. This is a text that is still relevant. And one of the most important of the political interpreters of the Bhagavad Gita, a guy named B.G. Tilak, who was Maharashtrian, argued that in previous eras, such as the era of the Vedanta commentators, that was the age of renunciation, and that was a time in which the Bhagavad Gita could indeed be interpreted as appropriate for renouncers, for religious people who were seeking personal salvation. But in the present age, which he called the age of action, it was necessary to understand the Bhagavad Gita in a different way, as a message of kind of active engagement in fundamentally political affairs. Mm-hmm. And so they emphasized, again, going back to these three paths, most of the politically engaged interpreters of the Bhagavad Gita in the 20th century emphasized the role of action, the way of action. In fact, Gandhi did as well, and he said, "Well, what are we supposed to be devoted to?" He argued that those who were devoted to Krishna in a sort of traditional way were in fact not doing anything useful, and a better form of devotion would be to feed the poor, or take up nursing, or, as he did, engage also in political activities aimed at, bettering the Indian population. So they were engaged in in an enterprise of really reassessing and identifying what devotion, what the message of the Bhagavad Gita is, and what the true meaning of devotion is. What is the true meaning of action? One of the major disagreements among those commentators, that is the early Indian commentators of the independence movement, had to do with the question of violence. And so for many of the Indian freedom fighters who were later called, or who were identified as extremists, like Tilak and the early Aurobindo, the fact that the Bhagavad Gita was a text of persuasion leading to Arjuna's willingness to fight in a righteous cause, that offered a good parallel to a recognition that, in fact, violence in the service of gaining independence from Britain might be an appropriate strategy, might be an appropriate path. For Gandhi, who was deeply philosophically committed to nonviolence, and who had, developed that philosophy in his work in South Africa before returning to India, that was impossible. It was impossible for him to interpret the Bhagavad Gita as a call to violence. So, in order to maintain his own philosophical commitment to nonviolence and yet be true to the clear rhetoric of the Bhagavad Gita, right, he had to interpret the Bhagavad Gita allegorically. So his argument was that, well, in fact, this war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas is a metaphor for the war that takes place in the lives of each of us between good and evil tendencies. And so Krishna is really calling on us, says Gandhi, for us to fight our own moral failings and to try to make sure that good prevails within our own lives.
That sort of gets at the real difficulty between interpretive communities of the same text, because you have some that can reasonably use the text to justify war and violence in the name of a greater good, and then you have Gandhi seeking a more personalized application of it, where it's about the war within yourself and sort of overcoming personal issues and urging nonviolence. But who can arbitrate between those interpretations? You can make either interpretation.
Yes. Well, it is important to, as you said before, to recognize that in Hinduism, there's no final arbiter of those kind of disputes. Those kind of disputes go on. And to me, that is one of the most not just fascinating, but also attractive features of Hinduism. That is that Hinduism is a kind of a open field for discussion. So those questions do not get resolved.
You have ongoing disputes about a book about disputes.
Exactly so. Exactly so.
I'm speaking today with Richard Davis. He's the director of the Asian Studies program at Bard College, that's in New York. And he's also the author of a biography of the Bhagavad Gita in Princeton's Lives of Great Religious Book series. Let's return to the origins of the text a second to talk about place and time and the way that place and time impacts the life of a religious text like this. So you're dealing with a text that's connected to an identifiable geographical location, and correct me if I pronounce this wrong, but Kurukshetra?
Kurukshetra, yes.
Yeah, so what implications does such specific location have for a text like the Gita? Are there things that happen at that location to the present time?
Right. That's a very interesting question. And I have spent some time in Kurukshetra looking into that. Kurukshetra is a small town in northwest of Delhi, and it's it's been a pilgrimage site for a long time, but it is if you compare its importance to the importance of the Mahabharata in Indian culture and the importance of the Bhagavad Gita in the history of Hinduism, it's quite surprising. It was quite surprising to me how minor Kurukshetra is, right? It is, a small city. And when you go there, there is a place that is identified as the exact place where Krishna and Arjuna had their conversation. There is a tree that grows there that is said, it's a banyan tree, and it's said to be the descendant of the original tree under whose shade Krishna and Arjuna spoke. There's no reference in the Bhagavad Gita to being under the shade of a banyan tree, but we'll leave that aside. And it's a very minor place. That was kind of surprising to me. Now, Kurukshetra, like many places in India, has been trying to boost its tourist profile. And so in the last 20 or so years, there have been a number of civic efforts to cash in, as a kind of a crude way of putting it, but to make the legacy of the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita more part of Kurukshetra's own appeal, that is to draw tourists in. And so there is now a very nice museum called the Sri Krishna Museum, which is, as far as I know, the only museum in India devoted to a single deity. And every year at the time of the birthday of the Bhagavad Gita has a birthday, there is a big festival. And the festival has been growing year by year over the last 20 or so years. It used to be, the Bhagavad Gita, the Gita Jayanti, the birthday of the Gita, has been celebrated for at least 100 years. I'm not sure how far it goes back. But by and large, it's been quite a small thing in which groups of Hindus would get together and collectively recite the entire Bhagavad Gita together. So it's, kind of a small recitative ceremony.
So is it more for the purpose of commemoration more so than any sort of salvational efficacy attached to the holiday?
I'd say both, but yes, probably more. Just a kind of a self-reminder of the teachings, but also in many communities you would fast. So there is a sense in which it's a very auspicious thing to do, a thing that would lead to some good spiritual karma. But in Kurukshetra now, there is a big festival that involves a crafts fair, processions. Holy men come in from all over to parade around, and then there are big dramatic performances. There are spiritual expositions of the Bhagavad Gita's teachings. So it's become, in Kurukshetra, kind of a major festival. It's quite recent again, but it's it's increasingly a part of the local culture of Kurukshetra. It's very nice. The Bhagavad Gita itself doesn't lend itself to performance in the way that other episodes from the Mahabharata do, right? It's just two guys talking, right? You can't do much with that. But what was the movie, My Dinner with Andre? There occasionally you run into something like that, but not very often. Other episodes, other incidents from the Mahabharata have, long dramatic traditions. But, the Bhagavad Gita is mostly a work that lends itself to exposition. So one of the things that I got interested in the course of doing this book was, how is the Bhagavad Gita performed? If it's not a dramatic text, then what are the ways that we can see it being performed? It is, in a way, a performative text. So I went around and visited participated in and listened in on different kinds of ways that the Gita is being recited nowadays in public contexts, the way in which different modern teachers are explicating the text for different kinds of audiences. So that was another sort of side of the Bhagavad Gita that I had never really thought about until I began to work on this book. So that's interesting. It's interesting to think about how texts are performed, even ones that we think of as philosophical texts. So it also led me to think, oh yeah, and when I teach that text, that's a kind of performance too. That's a kind of performance for a particular audience, college students. Mm-hmm. So it gave me a kind of a little opportunity to reflect on my own ways of presenting.
That's a really interesting way to think about it, is another type of performance of the text.
Yeah.
So we talked a bit about the Gita as a text in a particular place and time, but one of the reasons your book was written, a biography of the text, is because the Gita has transcended those original things. But you touched on this a little bit earlier, the question about how a revelation given in a particular time through a particular person with all of those cultural trappings ends up transcending its origins. And Hindu philosophers have talked about the eternal Vedas, and that the text reflects eternal, not just temporal concerns. But yet, if you look at the text, it's very couched in a historical time period. So how do you approach the doubleness, is what you call it, the doubleness of the historical and eternal aspects of this book?
Yeah, well, that is really the kind of the central conundrum that I've thought about and tried to deal with throughout the writing of this book. And I don't know if I have a final answer, but I used as a sort of a epigraph for my conclusion a statement by the Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin, and he talks about how texts and particularly great texts live on in what he calls great time. Great time meaning a time way beyond the historical circumstances of their own composition. And for me, the way that they live on in great time is by entering into dialogue with other readers who encounter them in their own time and place and read them seriously, not as historical texts of another time, but as containing potentially relevant teachings to their own time, their own situation. So for me, the idea of a kind of readers entering into a dialogue with a text from another tradition, oftentimes, it was a very kind of productive way of thinking about the way in which different readers over time have engaged with the Bhagavad Gita. And I think that's a kind of an approach that is general. That is, that we could think about approaching, the way in which readers approach the Book of Job or the Sufi poetry of Rumi in the same way. That is, it's not simply an act of interpretation, but an act of kind of engagement and dialogue in which there's a kind of a give and take between the text and the reader, and the reader brings his or her own presuppositions, agendas, premises, all to that work, but also has to be open, has to have a kind of a interpretive openness to the way in which the text, to the things that the text wants to say.
Yeah, I've got the Bakhtin quote here, part of it anyway. It says, "There is neither a first word nor a last work. Even meanings born in dialogues of the remotest past will never be grasped once and for all, for they will always be renewed in later dialogue." And that kind of sums up what you do with the concluding fourth of the book or so. One thing I was interested in is the book really took off in Germany. Why is that? Sort of in the 19th century. What was that?
Yes, yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. Why does a text take off in certain places and certain times? Germany, at the time, this was the very end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th. So this was the beginning of the Romantic period, and for reasons that are kind of peculiar. Many of the earliest Romantic thinkers identified India as being the kind of the beginning of civilization, right? So they thought maybe Eden had been somewhere in India. Maybe the Ganges River was the actual first place of civilization. So they, as a kind of a response to their own distress about the way European civilization appeared to them, they were interested in going back to a kind of a primordial way of being. So even before any of these texts appeared, right? So the Bhagavad Gita was first translated in 1785 into English, and then
is that the one who did the kind of King James-ish speech?
Yes, right. Charles Wilkins, lots of these and thous.
Yeah.
And he was a British official, one of the greatest of the early Sanskritists.
Yeah.
But that was the first text. The Bhagavad Gita was the first direct translation of a Sanskrit work into a European language. So it was a very important moment in the kind of the history of Indology, but also of the Western knowledge of the East. And Germany was somehow riper than any place else for just a kind of a fascination with these new works that started arriving from India, in part because, again, they were interested in finding a way to go back to a more original and more morally grounded way of being that they thought might have been at the beginning of time, or the beginning of human civilization.
Romanticization of
yes
of an exotic culture. How did the translation that I have, which is by the Vedanta Society of Southern California, how did that wind up with an introduction by Aldous Huxley? And I assume it's from an earlier iteration.
Yes, that's a very interesting translation, and it's one of my favorites. So the translation was done by two people, Swami Prabhavananda, who was one of the Vedanta teachers, very popular with the Hollywood crowd in the 1940s, and Christopher Isherwood, the British poet and novelist who had ended up living in Southern California by around 1940. So, and he was a friend of Aldous Huxley. Now, Aldous Huxley went around the country in around 1938, 39, speaking against war. He was a pacifist, and during the war, he was in a kind of a deep state of despair over what was going on in World War II. It was many people were, of course, and what he did, his response to the World War II was to try to gain from all of the religious literatures of the world what he called a perennial philosophy, right? A single philosophy that he believed was underlying all of the major religious traditions. And so his own work, The Perennial Philosophy, is basically an anthology of teachings from all different traditions that he sees as forming a single philosophical perspective that is, again, a human perspective. So for Huxley, the Bhagavad Gita offered probably the most succinct description of or articulation of that perennial philosophy that he found in all religions. So, and he was a friend of Isherwood, so he wrote the introduction. And in that introduction, again, he's sort of trying to make the argument that the Bhagavad Gita offers that articulation of the perennial philosophy that he believed common to all the world religious traditions. And that would be in the present world, that is in 1945, the salvation of the post-war world.
Okay. I mean, appearing right then, yeah, it carried a lot of weight, obviously, with people's minds very attuned to warfare and
and what are we going to do next? After the bomb, after the Holocaust, how are we going to remake the world?
So what's really interesting is that was just one of several Gita translations. You talk about the Gita's new clothes, the translations that proliferated as the text's popularity grew. So following another scholar of translation, you talk about a few considerations that translators have to take into account when they're working with a book like the Gita. So what are some things that make it difficult, or that translators have to reckon with when they're putting it into a different language?
Right. Well, I think the first thing that they really have to reckon with is their audience, right? They have to think about what kind of audience they want to address. And then they also have to have an idea about what they think the text is really. And in a text like the Bhagavad Gita, is it a devotional text? Is it a philosophical text? Is it a historical text? Is it a form of poetry? It's all of those things, right? And so those kind of decisions really end up being very centrally reflected in the kind of translation that is produced. That is the conception about what the text is and their own sense of who they're speaking to and for.
In the book, you talk about different Gitas for different readers. You mentioned audience. You talk about a scholar's Gita, a poet's Gita, devotee's Gita, and a philosopher's Gita. Take a second to kind of unpack those.
Yes, right. Well, the scholar's Gita was the kind of the Gitas that I grew up on as a graduate student, right? The Gitas that assume that this is a historical text of classical India, and that the people that are going to be interested in reading this translation want a kind of scholarly accuracy. They want to understand who the Gita was speaking to in its original time of composition, and they want to be able to see how it set forth its own teachings and ideas in that kind of context, in that world. So the Scholar's Gita, is really a Gita that tries to maintain a certain fidelity, a very strong fidelity, I should say, to the original composition. And again, that's the kind of translations that I've valued a lot when I've been teaching the Bhagavad Gita as a historical text. But if you assume that the kind of readers that you are wanting to address have different intentions, then your translation might take on a different complexion. So the second kind of Gita that I talk about is a poet's Gita. You mentioned the Isherwood and Prabhavananda translation. So Isherwood, of course, was a literary figure, and he was very attuned to the poetic qualities of the text. So that's one example. So the poet's Gita. Stephen Mitchell is a poet who has produced translations very broadly of religious works from multiple traditions, so including works from the Bible, Sufi poetry, Chinese works, and the Bhagavad Gita. And he obviously can't know all of those languages, and he cheerfully says that he does not know any Sanskrit. He says, there are plenty of English translations, so why should I worry about that? So he is not concerned with a kind of scholarly accuracy to the original Sanskrit. He's not capable of that. But he believes that the Bhagavad Gita, is a wisdom text, is a text that sets forth kind of fundamental religious teachings in a highly poetic way. So the kinds of concerns that he talks about in his introduction are like, well, what kind of meter in English would be best to convey the kind of poetic quality of the original Sanskrit? So again, it's not a scholar's translation by any means, but he's really trying to make the Bhagavad Gita speak to a contemporary American audience.
Is this the same person who hasn't he done the Epic of Gilgamesh and some other translations?
He has done many other translations, yeah.
Okay. So then you've got the devotees' Gita.
Right. So what if you believe that Krishna is in fact God and you are a devotee of him? Right. Then the quality of the text is very different and has to be presented in a different way. So the devotees' Gita that I talk about is the first translation that I ever saw, the translation by Swami Prabhupada, who is the founder of the ISKCON, the Hare Krishna movement in the West. And he came out of a very long-standing devotional school in India. And in order to present the Bhagavad Gita to his new audience of Western devotees of Krishna, he wanted to, first of all, convey very clearly that this was always God speaking. And then he also wanted to teach his new followers how to recite properly. So there's a kind of a whole apparatus built into the translation explaining how to pronounce and how to recite. And then for each verse, he also gives a commentary, which again is a kind of an old, long-standing Hindu tradition. How do you learn the Bhagavad Gita? Well, you learn it not only by verses, but also with a commentary. So he gives a purport of each verse, and in that purport, he's able to teach the basics of what Krishna consciousness is. So that's a kind of a devotional approach to the text. And again, there are many similar texts, translations that also contain commentaries presenting other perspectives on the text.
And then you've got the Philosopher's Gita, and versions geared toward a more philosophical angle, different than the other three?
Yeah, a little bit different. So the figure that I focus on is Sarvepalli Radhakrishna, who was a very important kind of mid-20th century Indian philosopher. And his great enterprise was to find a way to unify or find common ground between the East and the West. And he was also writing in this period of new Indian independence, World War II and its aftermath. And so he really wanted to show that the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita spoke to Western philosophical concerns as well as Indian ones. So he also includes a commentary in his translation. But instead of citing other Indian philosophical perspectives, he's often citing Spinoza or Hume or Descartes or Plato or books from the Bible. So his idea was, again, to kind of find use the Gita as a way to bridge what for many was a big cultural, civilizational gap between the East and the West, or between European thinking and Indian thinking. So for him, it was translating the Bhagavad Gita was part of a larger philosophical enterprise. And so he viewed the text, again, not in primarily religious terms, but primarily as a philosophical exposition.
I'm speaking today with Richard Davis. He's the director of the Asian Studies program at Bard College in New York. He's author of a biography of the Bhagavad Gita in Princeton's Lives of Great Religious Book series. We're going to take a break and be right back with the conclusion of this episode of the Maxwell Institute podcast. Hey, this is Blair Hodges from the Maxwell Institute podcast. Did you know the Maxwell Institute now offers digital subscriptions to our 3 periodicals? $10 gets you access to the latest issues of the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, the Mormon Studies Review, and Studies in the Bible and Antiquity. All 3 for just $10. Or hey, maybe you're like me and you still love the heft of a journal printed on actual paper. Well, print subscriptions are also available, and a print subscription to any one of our journals includes digital access to all 3 of them. You can subscribe at our website. Go to maxwellinstitute.byu.edu/subscribe for more information. We're back with Richard Davis. He wrote a biography of the Bhagavad Gita and Princeton's Lives of Great Religious Book series. Richard, I spent a little time looking for books like yours that analyze the history of the Gita as a religious text and how it's been interpreted over time, but I didn't find much of anything. You can find dozens of books about, hundreds of books about biblical texts and things like that. Is there a comparative dearth in similar studies of the Gita, or was I just didn't spend enough time looking?
Right. There aren't as many as one would expect. There are a number of very good ones, but they only deal with particular periods in the life of the Gita. So I claim that this is the first life of the biography of the Bhagavad Gita to deal with the whole life comprehensively. But along the way, I read and make good use of other scholars who have written on, for instance, the Bhagavad Gita as it was interpreted by the Vedanta philosophers. There's a very fine book by Arvind Sharma called The Hindu Gita. There are a couple of very good books about the Gita among German philosophers, right? There are several books that look at the Gita as it was interpreted in the Indian independence movement, right? So there are my chapters, each chapter, how should I say this? For each chapter, one could find at least 1 or 2 scholarly treatments that are not directed, that are more scholarly in their orientation. So there have been studies. I'm not. This is not at all a unique enterprise that I'm engaged in, but attempt to present this broader span of the life of the Bhagavad Gita, and do so for a general, intelligent but non-specialized audience. That's, I think, what this biography is all about.
Right. So you interact with a lot of other scholarship that's been produced. And a book like this is always kind of a communal production in terms of getting assistance and advice from other people. Did you also speak with Hindu practitioners that assisted with the book at all, or kind of gave their input on the manuscript?
Not so much, no. What I did was spoke with Hindu practitioners who were performers. So that was a sort of a underpinning for for certain sections of the Gita. But by and large, the community of that I acknowledge in the acknowledgments, right? The people that I discussed different ideas and my own approach with, we're by and large scholars in Indian studies, and also, other people in other areas of religious studies.
It's kind of a fraught area. I'm thinking of Wendy Doniger, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, who wrote an alternative history of the Hindus and caused a stir and has been condemned by certain Hindu fundamentalist groups and things. Have you thought about any potential backlash like that, or do you think your book would face something like that as well?
Yeah, thank you for asking me that question. Indeed, I have. So Wendy Doniger, who, as you say, has been a controversial figure. She's a very respected scholar of Hinduism among American academics and international academics, but for reasons that are not all entirely clear to me, she has been identified as the sort of the Wicked Witch of the West by a lot of Orthodox or what people I would call Hindu nationalists. She wrote a review of my book, the first review to come out in the New York Review of Books, and that, in fact, she got a lot of flack for the things that she said. Somehow it was like she was the lightning rod of the, she took all the lightning, and I sort of, I was down there in the house somewhere thank God she did it. I don't write polemically, and I didn't write with the intention of provoking anyone, but it's certainly possible, and has entered my mind a lot, that a Hindu nationalist, a person who's devoted to taking the Hindu tradition as infallible, could see my study as being provocative and deeply problematic. There was people told me, no, never read your the responses on Amazon.com, but the first review on Amazon.com was from somebody who was clearly hadn't read this book, but was fulminating about my own, what's this American doing writing about the Hindu Bible, and how could he say that it was invented in the 1785 by Charles Wilkins, so there was a kind of a way in which it was a predictable
is that the person
response.
That called it a monstrosity? Is that
probably so? Yes. So I did read that.
It says it's a fashionable money-making gig, so I don't know. Was that?
Yes. Well, that's. I'm definitely making a lot of money out of this. As I, take my yacht down to the Caribbean.
Yes. But for you, kind of like water off a duck's back. I mean, you don't have to face too much of the more fundamentalist type of criticism, right? It's just you'll maybe see some things online or.
So far, that's been the case, right? There have been some quite serious attacks on other American scholars who have said things that, oftentimes from out of the blue provoke different kinds of groups in India.
Yeah.
So it's not something that to take completely lightly. But so far, so far it's just been water off my back. And I'm hoping that it stays that way.
Yeah. Well, I do too. So in your acknowledgments, you thank the series editor, Fred Appel, and you say that his invitation to write this book sent you on a journey that's been challenging and rewarding. And then you say that your journey's not over yet. So I'm interested where your journey's headed then. What's ahead for you?
So when I first began work on this, I got very excited about it and wrote a lot, including quite long chapters on individual readers of the Bhagavad Gita. And I showed some of this to the series editor, Fred Appel, and he said, well, Richard, there's a, 40,000 word limit to this book, and this is really for, the readers of the New Yorker, not for, your fellow scholars. And, can you rewrite this a little bit and cut out about half of it? And it was very good advice. And so I had to go back and start over. But now I'm interested in trying to recover some of those longer chapters. And the longer chapters go along with what we were talking about earlier in terms of Bakhtin and his notions of dialogue, and my idea of readers as being situated readers who engage in a dialogue with a text. So I'm interested now in trying to write some longer essays on individual readers of the Bhagavad Gita. And this the biography that I've written, Gandhi gets about 8 pages. I'd like to write a 40-page or 50-page essay on Gandhi's reading of the Bhagavad Gita and really sort of explore it in much more detail. I'd like to do one on Thoreau. I'd like to do one on J. Robert Oppenheimer. So I'm interested in continuing this work on the reading of the Bhagavad Gita, but
have there
doing
been
it
any popular ones like that on any women that have been
very
prominent
good
readers?
question. No, other people have urged me to think about that, and no, there is nothing like that. One really interesting reader of the Bhagavad Gita who I have thought about is Annie Besant, who was an Irish radical who went to India. She became active in the Indian independence movement, and also produced one of the translations of the Bhagavad Gita. So that would be actually. Thank you for asking me that, because she's a person that I do need to follow up on. By and large, there are female readers of the Bhagavad Gita prior to, I don't know, 1950 are, we don't have records. We don't have lots of material about that.
It sounds like it's a lot of work ahead, though. It sounds like there's a whole lot of stuff you can do.
It is indeed, yeah. So this is it's an ongoing project, and of course I never have enough time. None of us ever do, but it's something. Again, this project has whetted my appetite for continuing to work on this material and sort of develop this kind of approach, not just to the Bhagavad Gita, but to thinking about how we read religious texts generally, both within faith traditions and outside of faith traditions.
That's Richard Davis. He's a professor of religion and director of the Asian Studies program at Bard College in New York. And he recently published a biography on the Bhagavad Gita in the Lives of Great Religious Books series. There's a link on the Maxwell Institute's website that'll give you more information about the book, and a link to Amazon where you can pick up a copy. Richard, thanks a lot for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Blair.